You've never bled for this business the way the rest of us have." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Mick Foley stood across from Hulk Hogan in the empty backstage area of Chicago's Allstate Arena, his scarred face twisted with 15 years of suppressed resentment. What happened in the next 8 seconds would shatter wrestling's most carefully constructed mythology. November 14th, 2004. Chicago, Illinois. The Allstate Arena had just hosted one of WWE's most brutal pay-per-view events, with several hardcore matches leaving wrestlers battered and bloodied for the entertainment of 18,000 screaming fans. But now, at 1:30 in the morning, the arena was quiet except for the conversation happening in the corner of the loading dock area. Mick Foley, known to wrestling fans as Mankind, Cactus Jack, and Dude Love, sat on a wooden crate, his body still aching from the punishment he had absorbed during his match earlier that evening. At 39 years old, Foley's body was a roadmap of wrestling violence. Missing teeth, a mangled ear, countless scars and joints that screamed in protest with every movement. Across from him stood Hulk Hogan, wrestling's golden boy, looking remarkably preserved for a man who had been performing for over 20 years. His trademark blonde mustache was perfectly groomed, his skin unmarked by the kind of damage that defined careers built on hardcore wrestling and physical sacrifice. They had been discussing the evolution of wrestling entertainment, specifically how the business had changed since Hogan's prime years in the 1980s. The conversation had started friendly enough, with both men sharing war stories and discussing the current state of the industry. But something had shifted when Hogan began critiquing the modern emphasis on extreme violence and hardcore wrestling. "I just think wrestling has gotten too focused on shock value," Hogan had said, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative tone. "The blood, the weapons, the extreme stunts, it's not what this business is really about. Wrestling should be about storytelling, about connecting with audiences through characters and drama, not about who can take the most punishment or create the most violent spectacle." Those words hit Mick Foley like a steel chair to the skull, because they dismissed everything that had defined his career and the careers of countless other wrestlers who had built their reputations on willingness to sacrifice their bodies for crowd reaction. "The hardcore stuff has its place," Hogan continued, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing in Foley's expression, "but it shouldn't be the main focus. It's a gimmick, really. A way for wrestlers who can't connect with audiences through traditional storytelling to get cheap heat and easy reactions." The implications were devastating. Hogan was essentially arguing that hardcore wrestling was a lesser art form, practiced by performers who lacked the charisma or storytelling ability to succeed through legitimate wrestling entertainment. "Real wrestling stars don't need to rely on blood and violence to get over with crowds," Hogan added, his tone suggesting he was sharing profound wisdom about the wrestling business. "They do it through personality, through creating characters that people care about, through matches that tell stories without needing weapons or extreme bumps." Foley's hands, which had been resting calmly on his knees, slowly clenched into fists. The scars on his knuckles, reminders of thousands of punches, thrown and received, stood out white against his weathered skin. "The wrestlers who last longest in this business," Hogan continued, "are the ones who learn to work smart, not hard. Who understand that preservation of their bodies is more important than one night's applause from bloodthirsty fans." The irony was staggering. Here was Hulk Hogan, whose entire career had been built on safe, formulaic matches and protective booking, lecturing about the proper approach to professional wrestling, while sitting across from a man who had literally given pieces of his body to entertain audiences. Foley stood up slowly from the wooden crate, his movement stiff and deliberate due to the accumulated damage of 15 years of hardcore wrestling. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an edge that made the few remaining crew members in the loading area stop what they were doing and pay attention. "Hulk," Foley said, his famous gap-toothed smile nowhere to be seen. I need to address something you just said about working smart versus working hard." Hogan turned toward Foley with his practiced, confident expression, the smile of someone accustomed to being approached by fellow wrestlers seeking advice or validation. "Sure, Mick. What's on your mind?" "What's on my mind," Foley said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "is that I've spent 15 years listening to you talk about the right way to do this business while I've been out there actually bleeding for it." The loading area went silent, except for the distant hum of arena ventilation and the occasional sound of equipment being moved. This was no longer a casual conversation between wrestling colleagues. This was about to become something much more personal and potentially explosive. Hogan raised his hands in what was meant to be a calming gesture. "Mick, I respect what you've accomplished. You're one of the most dedicated wrestlers I've ever known. If I said something that came across as dismissive of hardcore wrestling, that wasn't my intention." "Wasn't your intention?" Foley's voice rose sharply, carrying 15 years of frustration with wrestling's hierarchy of respect. "You just spent 10 minutes explaining how hardcore wrestling is a gimmick for wrestlers who can't get over through real storytelling. You called it cheap heat and easy reactions." Foley began pacing in the small loading area, his energy filling the space despite his physical limitations. "You want to talk about cheap heat, Hulk? Let's talk about your entire career. The same entrance, the same poses, the same 3 moves, and the same finish for 25 years. You call that storytelling? I call that the easiest formula in wrestling history." The accusation hit its mark. Hogan's face flushed red, not with embarrassment but with genuine anger. His hands, which had been raised peacefully, now clenched into fists that looked capable of serious damage. "Mick, you need to be careful about what you're saying here," Hogan said, his voice carrying a warning tone that few wrestlers had ever heard. "I've earned my place in this business through decades of hard work and connecting with audiences. My formula works because it gives fans what they want to see. What they want to see." Foley shot back, his voice now loud enough to echo through the loading area. "Or what's safe and easy for Hulk Hogan. Because I've seen what fans really want, and it's not the same 5 moves performed by a guy who's more worried about preserving his look than giving them a real show." The personal nature of the attack was escalating beyond typical wrestling business disagreements. This was character assassination, delivered by someone who had earned the right to question anyone's commitment to entertainment through personal sacrifice. "You know what really gets me about your attitude, Hulk?" Foley continued, his voice carrying the weight of every hardcore bump he had ever taken. "It's not that you play it safe. Everyone has the right to protect their body. It's that you act like playing it safe makes you superior to wrestlers who are willing to sacrifice everything for this business." Foley gestured to his own scarred and battered body. "You see these scars? Each one represents a moment when I chose to give fans something real instead of something safe. You see this missing ear? That's what happened when I cared more about their entertainment than my own appearance. You see these missing teeth? That's the price of actually bleeding for this business." The silence that followed was profound. Foley had just presented his physical damage as evidence of his superior commitment to wrestling, while implicitly arguing that Hogan's unmarked body represented a lack of genuine sacrifice. "You've never bled for this business the way the rest of us have," Foley said, his voice now carrying absolute conviction. "You've spent 25 years protecting Hulk Hogan, while guys like me have been destroying ourselves to give fans something authentic. And then you have the nerve to call our sacrifices gimmicks and cheap heat." Hulk Hogan stood perfectly still for exactly 8 seconds, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, hurt, and finally a determination that anyone who knew him well would recognize as dangerous. During those 8 seconds, the entire loading area held its breath, waiting to see how wrestling's biggest star would respond to being accused of never truly sacrificing for the business. When Hogan finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more authority and wisdom than any shout could have conveyed. Every word was precisely chosen, delivered with the kind of measured intensity that comes from decades of dealing with challenges both inside and outside the wrestling ring. "Mick," Hogan said, never breaking eye contact, "you're absolutely right about one thing. I have protected my body throughout my career. I have chosen safe over spectacular, preservation over destruction, and I'm not ashamed of that choice." The admission stunned everyone within earshot. Hulk Hogan never admitted to playing things safe, never acknowledged choosing preservation over performance, never confirmed what hardcore wrestlers had always suspected about his approach to the business. "But you're wrong about everything else," Hogan continued, his voice growing stronger while remaining completely controlled. "Dead wrong. And the fact that you can't see the difference proves that for all your sacrifice and dedication, you still don't understand what this business is really about." The power dynamic in the conversation had shifted completely. Hogan was now the one delivering the education, and Foley was being forced to listen to a perspective he had never seriously considered. "You think sacrifice is about how much damage you can absorb," Hogan said. "You think dedication means destroying your body for crowd reaction. But real sacrifice in this business is about making the choices that help wrestling succeed long-term, even when those choices aren't popular with hardcore fans." Hogan gestured around the empty arena, where the evidence of the evening's violence was still being cleaned up by maintenance crews. "You want to talk about bleeding for the business? Let me tell you about a different kind of bleeding. The kind that happens when you choose to be the villain so someone else can be the hero. The kind that happens when you put over younger talent even when it hurts your own position. The kind that happens when you make decisions that benefit the entire industry instead of just getting yourself over." The response was gaining momentum, and Foley was beginning to realize he might have underestimated his opponent. "You've spent 15 years destroying your body to entertain fans," Hogan continued. "That's admirable, and I respect the hell out of it. But I've spent 25 years building an industry that can support thousands of wrestlers and their families. Which one of us has really sacrificed more for the business?" The question hit its mark because Foley knew the answer, and it wasn't flattering to his argument. Hogan's mainstream success had indeed helped elevate wrestling from niche entertainment to global phenomenon, creating opportunities for countless performers. "You call my approach safe and easy," Hogan said, his voice growing more passionate while remaining controlled. "Do you know what's actually safe and easy? Knowing that if you take enough bumps and bleed enough blood, hardcore fans will respect you regardless of whether you're actually helping the business grow." Hogan leaned forward slightly, his intensity increasing without his voice rising. "What's hard is maintaining a character that appeals to mainstream audiences for decades. What's difficult is making creative choices that benefit the entire industry instead of just satisfying your own desire to be seen as tough or hardcore." The education was continuing, and Foley was being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the difference between personal sacrifice and industry leadership. "You want to know what the real difference is between us, Mick?" Hogan asked. "You've spent 15 years proving how tough you are to wrestling fans. I've spent 25 years proving to the mainstream world that wrestling deserves respect and attention." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Foley had indeed built his reputation primarily within wrestling circles, while Hogan had successfully brought wrestling to mainstream audiences who had never cared about the industry before. The loading area remained silent for several more seconds, as both men processed what had just happened. Finally, Foley spoke, his voice much quieter now, almost uncertain. "So you're saying that your mainstream success was more valuable to wrestling than our hardcore sacrifices?" he asked. "I'm saying that sacrifice comes in many forms," Hogan replied simply. "You sacrificed your body for wrestling fans. I sacrificed my creative freedom for mainstream acceptance. Both sacrifices were necessary for the business to succeed, but only one of them built a foundation that could support an entire industry. The conversation that followed lasted another 40 minutes, with the initial confrontation evolving into something resembling a master class in wrestling business philosophy. Hogan explained how his mainstream appeal had opened doors for all wrestlers, while Foley shared his perspective on how hardcore wrestling had given the industry credibility with fans who craved authenticity. By the end, what had started as a bitter accusation about bleeding for the business had become a dialogue about different types of sacrifice and their relative value to wrestling's long-term success. "I owe you an apology," Foley said. "What I said about you never bleeding for the business was unfair. You bled in different ways I never considered." Hogan extended his hand, and they shook with genuine respect. "And you've reminded me that hardcore wrestlers built their reputations on real sacrifice. That deserves recognition." The confrontation's impact spread throughout wrestling. Hardcore wrestlers began seeing Hogan's mainstream success differently, while the debate about sacrifice types influenced industry booking approaches. 8 seconds of silence had transformed potential warfare into education about the different ways wrestlers serve the business they love. The debate sparked by their confrontation rippled through wrestling circles for months afterward. Hardcore wrestlers found themselves defending their approach while considering Hogan's arguments about industry-wide impact. Mainstream performers began showing more appreciation for the physical sacrifices made by hardcore legends. Wrestling schools started teaching the conversation as an example of how different philosophies could coexist and contribute to the industry's growth. The Foley-Hogan exchange became a case study in recognizing that sacrifice takes many forms, some visible through scars and missing teeth, others through creative choices that build entire industries. Young wrestlers, entering the business, learned that success didn't require choosing between hardcore authenticity and mainstream appeal. Both paths could lead to meaningful contributions to wrestling's evolution and growth. The loading dock confrontation at Chicago's Allstate Arena proved that some of wrestling's most valuable moments happened away from cameras and crowds, in quiet spaces where honest conversation could bridge seemingly impossible philosophical divides. Years later, when wrestling historians examined the period when hardcore wrestling gained mainstream acceptance while maintaining its authentic edge, many pointed to this November night as a catalyst for mutual understanding between different wrestling philosophies. The phrase, "You've never bled for this business," became shorthand within wrestling for the importance of recognizing different types of sacrifice and commitment, whether measured in physical damage or industry-building achievement.